All right, session 2, Introduction to Active Directory Services. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Active Directory. So yes, last session, in the first session, you guys should have built your Server 2016s, okay? But basically, like we said last lesson, when you actually install just the operating system, it's just nothing more than a bit of a glorified Windows 10 computer, okay? It's got some, it's optimized for services, but it's really doing nothing more than what you would do with Windows 10. But today we're going to take that same server, we're going to take that server which is got the Server 2016 operating system, and we're going to turn it into a specialized server, an Active Directory domain controller. Okay, so have you guys heard of Active Directory before? Yeah, maybe. What do you think it does? What's its main function, do you think? Yes, who can have access in general, okay? So folders is one thing, and who can access to what folder, that's one thing, and that's what we'll learn about in the future. But basically, Active Directory is a database, okay? It contains your user accounts, it contains your group accounts, it contains all the information that you need to control people's access. Okay, it's an authentication service. That's the main functionality. So when you actually log into Learn today, when you logged onto your email, when you logged onto your Wi-Fi, if you had a phone or a mobile phone or a laptop, when you logged into our Wi-Fi here, you probably noticed that you used the same username and password, didn't you? Okay, the same user password you logged onto the computer, to the Wi-Fi, to Learn, and to your email. Why is that? Because they're all sending their login informations back to our Active Directory servers here at TAFE SA. Okay, they're called domain controllers. Okay, so Active Directory, we have a unit called a domain, and a domain is the basic building block for Active Directory, and it basically means that anyone who's inside the domain is trusted. Anyone who's outside the domain is not trusted. So you guys have accounts in our Active Directory domain, tafesa.edu.au. Okay, you guys have accounts which basically gives you access. Okay, gives you access to your email, gives you access to your Wi-Fi, gives you access to all of those things that we spoke about. So today we're going to actually do that and install Active Directory and make our glorified Windows 10 Server 2016, which is not doing anything more, and turn it into a specialized computer called a domain controller. So today's object, yeah, what's your question? The Server 2016 VMs and the Windows 10, okay? So if you forgot, I'll put it up on screen again. So on your L drive, IT Studies NAS, Microsoft VMs, and it's the Windows 10 plus the Server 2016 VMs that we need as part of our practical that we'll be doing later, okay? So make sure you get a copy of yourself. And if you're obviously an external student, you need to go to TAFE and get a copy of these. You need a portable hard drive because they're very big. I think they're combined about 20 odd gigs. Okay, so we'll get back to our PowerPoint. That's all right. It's better to get this straightened out than when we need it and not have it. Okay, so today's objective is to understand what is Active Directory. Some planning, looking at some planning for Active Directory servers. You don't just go off and build it and hope for the best. You have to have some idea of how you're going to structure the Active Directory. Okay, if you by the end of the lesson, you'll know that it's actually a hierarchical system, and just like you would plan out a file system so that you can optimize where you keep files and you can find it all the time, and how you organize it and how you control access to it, Active Directory is just like that. It's like a file system, but it's a directory service, and instead of files and folders, you have organizational units and objects like users, groups, and so forth. Okay, and we'll also look at planning the namespace, the DNS namespace. You'll realize that if you ever get anything out of my courses, you'll realize that I always say this: no DNS, no Active Directory. Okay, basically, if your DNS is not working, your Active Directory will not work, because in DNS, besides resolving names to IP addresses like what DNS does on the internet, on the Active Directory integrated DNS in the domain, it actually provides the service records for actually finding these Active Directory servers like the domain controller. and sending your authentication information to the right servers. We'll look at the idea of sites and replication, so we'll talk about it. We're not going to actually do sites in this subject. Obviously, this is the first level of Windows Server 2016. We just need to know of it. Then we're going to go through the Active Directory installation process, as well as part of that, we'll be installing the DNS service, and as well as the Active Directory services role. Okay, so if you remember from last lesson, a server role is basically a group of packages that gets installed on your server to actually make it do something more than just be an operating system. All right, yeah, question? Yeah. Basically, you're right. Like I said, the Server 2016 without any server roles installed on it is basically a glorified Windows 10. Okay, it's just like it. It's basically Server 2016 is Windows 10 Server. Okay, basically you cannot install these server roles that we're talking about on a Windows 10 workstation machine. Okay, so that's the reason. If Microsoft wanted you to, they will allow you to. But at the end of the day, they've actually made these server roles only installable on the server operating system. Okay, when I say it's like a Windows 10, glorified Windows 10, I'm saying they're sharing the same kernel. Okay, so it's very similar. Okay, obviously it's not exactly the same. One's optimized for foreground applications, your Windows 10 for your home user or user in front of the computer. One's optimized for background applications such as services, which is for people who are not sitting in front of the server but sitting on the network somewhere accessing services on the server. But what I was trying to get across was that server without any specialized role installed on it is just like Windows 10 because it's not doing anything extra. But today we're going to turn it into something more by actually putting the Active Directory Services server role onto it and making it a specialized server. And from that point, it's no longer like Windows 10. Okay, so let's get back to our PowerPoint. So understanding Active Directory. So first of all, Microsoft has two networking approaches. Okay, there's what's called a workgroup approach and a domain approach. Okay, so what is a workgroup? A workgroup is basically where you don't have any specialized computers. Okay, if you have a network of any size. Okay, for example, at home you've got your computer, your sister's computer, your parents' computer. You plug them all into your Wi-Fi router, and they become a network. Basically, all your computers are individuals. Okay, they're not working together as a team or any way. It's like they all are on the same network, and you can close the door. Yeah. So they're not working together at all. There's no centralized management. There's no control. So basically, the way they work is that each one is in charge of itself. Okay, each one is in charge of itself, meaning that each computer takes care of its users, its files, and its networking access and control. Okay, so if these computers in front of us were all in a workgroup computer, we would, if in order for me to log on to this computer, I would have to have an account created on this computer. If I then change computers to one of these other computers, I would have to have an account created on those computers. And if you look around, there's 20 computers in this room, and if I wanted to log on to every one of these computers and they were in a workgroup, I would have to create an account on every one of these 20 computers, okay, in order to log on to them. So what's even worse is, what if I need to change my password? Let's say I've accidentally forgot my password, or I've told someone else my password, I need to change it. If I want to actually change it on all these 20 computers, I have to go to each one of these computers and change it. And you can see how messy that can get, isn't it? Instead of doing it once and that's done, you go into every one of these computers. Okay, whereas in a domain, there is a specialized computer, and that computer is called a domain controller. Okay, it's in charge of all the users and their accounts. It's in charge of your username and passwords. So therefore, if I want a user that can log into any computer that's in the domain, I will just create an account in the Active Directory domain on the domain controller. If I actually create an account, and I can go to any of these computers which are on the domain and log in. I do it once. And you know what? If I need to change my password, I just go to my domain controller, find my user account, and reset my password, and I will be able to use that same password to log on any of the computers again with that new password. So one is obviously the advantage of a workgroup is cheap. It's very easy to set up. What does that mean? You take your computer at home, you plug into the network, bang, you got a Microsoft workgroup. Okay, a workgroup is a loose collection of these machines that work together, but not really as a team, as individuals. Okay, if you like to think of it, a workgroup is like a party. You go to a party, you hang out with a group of friends, you might interact with each other, but really you don't really, you're not really part of a team, are you? You go your separate ways and you do your separate things. Whereas a domain is like the military. Okay, if you're in the military, you're part of a unit, you're part of a team, and you have a hierarchy, meaning there's specialized people, there's people who actually are in charge, there's people who are not in charge, and that's like the domain controller compared to the regular computers in the domain. Okay. The workgroup is cheap to set up, so there's no special computer required, there's no special equipment required. But the downside is that because of no centralized management, it's very hard to administer. Like I said, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 computers, okay, to have a work group. But for someone like me who's a bit lazy, if you have more than 5 computers in a work group and you need to actually manage them all, it just gets a little bit too much work. Okay, so whereas a domain, it's actually costs more to set up in the first place, because you need to have a specialized equipment with a specialized server called a domain controller installed. So that's extra expense. And it obviously requires extra skills. Okay, so anyone can manage a Windows 10 computer, workstation computer. Not a problem, most people can use that. But you need specialized skills to manage a domain controller and the services that you configure. Okay? That's why you're here in doing this subject, to start learning some of that. But the good thing about domain is that it's very scalable, meaning that your network can grow from 10 computers to 100 computers to 1,000 computers. Okay, to some of the very largest networks in the world have Active Directory running on them. You can have multiple sites. Rather than just having one network, you can have multiple networks all connected, interconnected with each other, and still controlled and managed centrally. So with a domain, you have centralized control and management by using domain controllers. There's centralized user counts. There's centralized policies, which is group policies, and we'll learn that in the full AWS subject, which is the next level of Server 2016. So Active Directory, or AD, is Microsoft's LDAP server. So LDAP is a open standard, okay? So which means that there's other companies that might have LDAP. So in the past there you had Novell, which also provided you with LDAP. LDAP stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. So basically, that means if Microsoft's Active Directory is an LDAP standard, it means anything that's written to use that LDAP standard can interact with Active Directory. Okay, think about it. The Learn side. Well, Microsoft didn't create the Learn side, did they? It's based on a Moodle, which is an open source online learning environment. What about your Wi-Fi? Okay, we use Cisco access points here. They're not Microsoft. Yet, when we actually use our access our Learn site or access our Wi-Fi, we're still using our Active Directory users and passwords, aren't we? It's because they are able to communicate with Active Directory because it's using the same standard, which is LDAP. Okay. So Active Directory contains objects. So everything in Active Directory is called an object. But there's different types of objects. There's users, groups, OUs, computers, servers, printers, and many more. And its main function in a network is for authentication. There's many other functions as well, but main function is authentication of network login. So when you guys got here today, turn on your computer, typed in your username and password, and clicked enter or log in, you actually sent all that information through the network to our computers on the network, which are domain controllers, and they check your username and password against that of the Active Directory database and confirm whether you can log in or not. Okay. So if we look at this diagram, you can see that the domain is represented by a triangle. So that's the traditional way of representing a domain, and later on we'll look at what many domains look like. Okay, so for example, in a domain here, inside the domain is trusted, outside of the domain is not trusted. It's a security boundary. Okay, it's all about security. So we have objects called organizational units. If you look at it, organizational units almost looks like a folder, doesn't it? All right, it works very much like a folder. Okay, basically in your file system, you use folders to organize your files into different types of files or different files for different projects or different reasons. We use organizational units to actually organize our Active Directory into different areas. Okay, for example, TFSA might be a domain, but under TFSA we might have different departments like IT studies, head and beauty, engineering. But wouldn't it be easier to look after the users of a specific department by putting all the users of that department into a specific container called a organizational unit? Okay, so that's what the organizational unit is for. It defines the hierarchy and the structure of your Active Directory. Okay, we have groups. Okay, we'll talk more about groups later on, and we'll learn something about the AGDLP methodology. But right now, groups, as we probably easily for us to understand, represents many users. Okay, so when we have user counts, they represent an individual human being. But if we have 1,000 IT studies students and we want to give all 1,000 IT students access to the L drive, for example, read access, if we actually had to do it per user, it means we had to add every individual user in, give them read access, and that's 1,000. That's a lot of work, isn't it? So I always say a good system administrator or network administrator is a lazy administrator, which means that they don't do everything manually or the hardest way. They find the easiest way and the most efficient way to get the job done and do it correctly. So instead of using individual users, we can actually create groups that represent IT studies students and then put all those users who are IT studies students as members of this group, and then give this group, this only one thing, this one group, permissions to a resource such as the L drive. We have objects called servers, and that represents obviously the server machines on the network. We've got computer machines, computer objects, which represents desktop computers that you might see in front of you. You got printers, and we'll learn more about printers later on, where we can actually publish printers into Active Directory and control access in Active Directory and be able to connect to printers that are published in Active Directory. Besides those type of objects, there's many more. Okay, so we're not going to be able to cover everything to do with Active Directory today, and it's obviously not the point. The point is to get started today. And there's also some built-in containers, and when you do your worksheet, you'll be exploring your Active Directory, you'll find some built-in containers. Okay, these containers contain the default user administrator, some default groups that might be in there, and some other objects. Like I said, the fundamental building block of Active Directory is a domain represented by a triangle here. But you can have several domains. Okay, the reasons for having many domains is that it might improve domain performance. Okay, so because if your company gets to such a size where it's so big, it might not actually be easily administrable. Okay, and so therefore you might want to decentralize administration, which sounds a bit funny because we just said one of the advantages of Active Directory was centralized administration. But when we're talking about thousands of users, tens of thousands of users or multiple sites, it's pretty hard to administer all of them in one go. Okay, it might be too much work for one person to do it. So what we can do, because of these organizational units in Active Directory, we can create these different departments, and we can create different domains that combine together to make a Active Directory tree. And we can actually delegate administration to these organizational units or other domains, so that instead of one person or looking after this whole big giant thing, we can have smaller areas where people are in charge of. And we can also use it to as a division of user based on the organizational lines when companies merge. Okay, so you could have multiple domains. For example, when two companies merge, you've got a Alex.com and a Zach.com, for example, and they both work in the same industry, let's say making lollies. But suddenly they decided, hey, why compete against each other? Let's merge. Now you've got two companies merged into one, but each of them already have their Active Directory and have their users. They don't want to just delete everything, so they can actually combine together and have multiple domains where they trust each other. Okay, so mutual trust, a two-way trust. So Active Directory domain services require one or more domain controllers. So the domain controllers are the servers, which actually has the Active Directory installed onto them, which contains the Active Directory database. All domain controllers hold a copy of the domain's database, which is continually synchronized, meaning that if I can have more than one domain controller. Okay, it's a Microsoft recommendation that it doesn't matter the size of your network, you should have at least 2 domain controllers because it's so important. Okay, remember we said that Active Directory authenticated your user login, doesn't it? Let's just say our Active Directory today died because the power supply was faulty. That just means that everyone that needed to log into these computers can't or may not be able to. So therefore, because it's so important, you should have at least 2 domain controllers of any type of network. So therefore, if you have 2 domain controllers, what's to say that I create a user on one domain controller and not the other? I don't have to do it in both places, I just do one. And when I create it on one, yeah, it replicates the other domain controller and synchronizes the information. So these domain controllers are constantly synchronizing or replicating with each other. Okay? Any of the changes. The domain is the context within which user accounts, computer accounts, and group accounts are created. Basically, it's saying we create users, groups, and all that kind of stuff in the Active Directory domain. The domain is also a replication boundary. So we just spoke about how we can have multiple domain controllers and they replicate with each other, but they only replicate with each other inside the same domain. If we have multiple domains and we have domain controllers in many domains, they don't replicate with each other. They only replicate with other domain controllers in the same domain. Okay. The domain is an administrative center for configuring and managing objects. Okay. Any domain controller can authenticate any sign-in. So basically, when we have multiple domain controllers, any of them can log you in or authenticate you. Okay. And the domain provides authorization. So authorization. So there's usually with security there's 3 A's: authentication, authorization, and auditing or accounting. Okay. What does that mean? Authentication means proving who you are. The way we prove who we are is with a username password. Okay, the domain controller does that. Authenticates you. But once you get authenticated, just because you can log in doesn't mean you just have unlimited access. Once you log in, you are actually given authorization to access resources at the level you're meant to have access. For example, the L drive is a classic one. L drive is where we put our student files. As a lecturer, I have read-write access to it because I'm a lecturer. But as students, you guys have read-only access, which means you can see it, you can use it, you can copy it, but you cannot change it, delete it, or do anything like that. And that's what I'm talking about, authorization. What are you authorized to do? What is your access level? And finally, the last A is auditing or accounting, which means just because you have the power to do something doesn't mean you should do it or you can do it without anyone knowing. So auditing and accounting keeps track of what people are doing. So therefore, if they're trying to do something that's yeah, they can do, but they shouldn't do. Like for example, if you're working for the tax department and you look into your best friend's income tax returns, that just because you can doesn't mean you should. And because of that, auditing keeps you honest. Okay, keeps the people honest. So domain controllers are used for domain provisioning, which means account provisioning, which means that you create Active Directory user accounts. It's for login processing, so you log in and you authenticate with the domain controller. The logon requests are processed through the Kerberos authentication service and the KDC service. Resource accessing processing. So basically, after you log in, like I said, you are given a ticket granting ticket. Okay. Which in turn gets you a session ticket, which is used to access the shared resources. Okay, so if you don't understand that, it's a bit like if you actually go to a music festival. Okay, first of all, you can get in. Okay, you got a ticket. That's your authentication. You get in. But you know that at some of these music festivals, you have adults and you have underage people. So they might give you a different wristband. So if you're adult, you can go access all the services like the alcoholic beverages. Whereas if you got an underage wristband, you'll be able to buy the soft drinks, but not the alcoholic beverages. Probably you guys pretty know that. So basically, that's the idea is they've all logged in, but based on their ticket granting ticket, they can get session tickets, and then that is used to control the access to resources. If you've got the adult wristband, you can get alcohol. If you've got the underage wristband, you can't. The Active Directory database replication, what does that mean? Like we said, you can make changes to any domain controller to the Active Directory. But once you make a change, those changes need to be replicated to all the other domain controllers so that everyone knows the exact same Active Directory database. It'd be a little bit silly if I actually have an account on one domain controller and on another domain controller I delete that account. So depending on who's authenticating you, if there was no replication, one will let you in, one won't. So replication gets them on the same page. So therefore it's deleted on one, it's deleted on all the domain controllers based on that replication. Okay? Yeah, go. Yeah. They're all on all the time. No, they're all on all the time, okay? And basically they will use whichever one is available at the time, okay? That's closest to you sometimes electronically, okay? But basically it doesn't matter which one authenticates you because they have the same Active Directory. And if I've deleted that account on one, it'll be replicated on that one, okay? So basically database replication, when changes are made on a domain controller, so if a change is made on this domain controller, then this becomes what's called the master replicator. The master replicator triggers a replication so that every other domain controller gets this change, okay? Gets this change. So that replicates the changes to all the other domain controller, and the Active Directory is what's called a multi-master replication model, which means that any domain controller can be the master replicator. Depends which domain controller the change was made on first. Okay. The best practice, like I mentioned, as far as availability, you need at least 2 domain controllers on any domain. Okay. For security, you may want to have a RODC, a read-only domain controller. And we'll talk more about that in the 4AWS subject. A read-only domain controller just sounds just like that. It's a read-only. You can't make changes on that domain controller, but it still can authenticate you. Okay, it doesn't store a copy of all your passwords, just like on a normal domain controller, all your passwords are actually stored on the database. On a read-only domain controller, it's not stored on that read-only domain controller. It's actually, the reason for having a read-only domain controller is so that you can actually still authenticate people in a network which is not very secure. For example, a public library, everyone can drop in and hook their laptops in and log into the computers, right? So it means that anyone could potentially compromise the domain controller. So if we had all your passwords and it can make changes on that domain controller, it could be potentially dangerous. But if in that situation, if we had a read-only domain controller, people can still log on because they will authenticate the logon request. But even if they compromise this read-only domain controller, there's no passwords on here for them to steal. And you can't make changes on this read-only domain controller that replicates to other domain controllers. Okay, so this is a specialized domain controller. And also there's BitLocker, which is basically, again, for security, for encrypting your files. Okay, so for example, if you have a server and someone physically takes that server, they could potentially get access to the hard drive by putting the hard drive into another computer and accessing it. But with BitLocker, which is an encryption technology, it actually encrypts the file system. Okay, so even if they take the hard drive out, put it in another computer, they can't actually read the contents of that computer. Yep. Oh, okay. Well, like the whole point of encryption is so it's almost impossible. Okay. So obviously it depends on the the length of your key and the key you actually use. Okay. If it's a dictionary word, the key, it's a lot easier to crack than if it's a mix of random characters, uppercase, lowercase, and symbols. Okay. So it's all based on that. So obviously there's what's brute force hacking, which basically tries every combination. But to be honest, like if you had a 128-bit encryption, that would take a very long time, even if it was automated. Okay. So the whole point is to not be able to break it, but obviously it's always possible for someone to hack something. And that's the philosophy you should always have. Always be paranoid that someone will be smarter, someone more technically savvy will be able to access your systems. So what steps can you take to prevent them? Okay. So what are organizational units? So we'll call them OUs from now on. Organizational units, OUs, they're containers. They're called containers because they contain other objects. Just like a folder contains files, an OU contains other objects such as other OUs, users, groups, computers, etc. Okay. We create OUs to configure objects by assigning GPO. So when we talk about group policy in the future, you'll realize that we apply group policies to containers. Okay, and basically where we apply it means that the group policy will be working on that area below. We can also use group policies to delegate administrative permissions. What does that mean? That means like if our domain is pretty big, for example, like TFSA is pretty big. The ICT doesn't want to be hounded with resetting students' passwords all the time. So how about this? How about I actually delegate so that the IT lecturers has the ability to reset the passwords of the students? That make their life easier, wouldn't it? And it will make my life easier. I won't have to tell you to call the ICT to get your password reset. I can just jump on and reset your password. So basically, delegating administration means I give people a level or ability to do something in Active Directory. It's like giving permissions in Active Directory. And I can do it based on organizational units, which means I don't do it at the very highest level. I find a level that's in our Active Directory that I'm happy to give someone permissions to and give them permissions from that point, which is usually an OU, and they will have it below, past that point, below that point. OUs are represented by a folder with a book on it. So if you look at it, it sort of looks like a folder, and you can see that there's like a little book icon inside the folder. Okay, if you can see that, you'll see that there's some of them that doesn't. Okay, like the built-in, the computers, the foreign principals, users. These are actually built-in containers. Remember how we mentioned there's some built-in containers? What does that mean, built-in? It means when you first install Active Directory, you're always going to get a built-in folder, a computer folder, a foreign security principal folder, and a user folder. And in them, they have group accounts, the administrator user account, and if you join a computer to the domain, those computers will automatically be put into this computer container. Okay. So like I said, we can have multiple domains and they can be related to each other. Okay, in this case, if you look at these, each triangle is a domain. And if you look at it, there's many domains together, but they're linked. They share a common namespace. If you look at it, this is the top domain is called company.com. If you like to think of it, the next level is sales.company.com. Whoa, if you look at it, doesn't that look like it's actually representing that sales is inside a company.com? Okay, it's like a path, isn't it? Just like on a file path on a file system, you have like a path. Here, it's a DNS namespace path. And here, internal.sales.company.com, you can see that internal is actually inside of sales, which is inside of company.com, isn't it? So in this case, this domain actually shares the same namespace because they all have the company.com as part of their name, and they are linked. Okay, this sales is a subdomain of company, internal is a subdomain of sales, and they're linked. And it looks like a Christmas tree, doesn't it? And this is what's called a domain tree. Okay, so groups of domains sharing the same namespace root, by default they trust each other, and this is mainly for a single company which is getting too big and they need to have separate domains to actually make it less complicated. Okay, we can also have what's called Active Directory forests. So obviously, if many domains make a tree, many trees make a forest, right? So that's where the name probably came from. So a collection of domain trees that share the same global catalog server as well as the schema, is an Active Directory forest. Again, they act as a security and trust boundary. So for example, each domain is a trust boundary. And these red arrows represents the trust they share between these domains. Okay, so if they're in a forest, you have to set up this trust. Okay, when it's a subdomain, there's already by default they already trust each other because they share the same namespace. This is a child domain. But when we have two domain trees which have different namespaces, they don't naturally or by default they don't trust each other. You have to set up this trust, okay, in order for them to be part of the same forest. So when you install these domain, new domains into the same forest, this trust will be set up for you. It acts like a trust boundary. So what does that mean? Basically means if we have this two-way trust, that if I was using Fabricam and I log in, then bang, 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 I log in and I get access, I can actually use that trust to then access this folder that's in alt.datum.com with the right access level because there's actually a trust. So I could actually have a group that's been given permissions here, which came from the Fabricam domain. Okay, so it can get pretty complicated. So in this subject, we'll probably stick with a single domain situation to start off with. But in the future, obviously, you can actually extrapolate and expand on that because they're just building blocks. Okay. So what is Active Directory schema or Active Directory Services schema? So the easiest, the way I've learned it the first time is a schema is like a cookie cutter. You probably think, what the hell is he talking about? Cookie cutter. You guys all know what a cookie cutter is? Not really? All right, so what about you guys? Do you know what a cookie cutter is? Yeah, basically a cookie cutter is where you might have seen your grandma or your mum do it. Roll out a piece of dough, cookie dough, flat. You go to the bottom drawer, you get this cookie cutter. Okay, if you want a star-shaped cookie, you get the star-shaped cookie cutter and you make a star-shaped cookie. If you want a tree-shaped cookie, moon-shaped cookie, you get that cookie cutter and you make that type of cookie. You're probably going, this guy's a bit crazy. What's he talking about cookie cutters? Well, let me put it this way. Would you say that that cookie cutter defines the property of the cookie? Yeah, if it's a star-shaped cookie, it's going to say that this cookie is going to have these star shape, these points, this size, and so forth. So it defines what the properties of the cookie. So a schema is like that because it actually is like, have you heard of the term schema or something that sounds like schema before? Yeah, they use schemas as well, but have you heard of any other plain old English words that sound like schema? Scheme? Did someone say scheme? Schematics? They all sound like schema, right? But you know that a scheme is like someone's plan. A schematic is a plan for a building or something, okay? So basically a schema is a plan for Active Directory objects. It's like the cookie cutter. It defines the properties of a Active Directory object. If I want to create a user object, I will go to the schema, load a user object, and it will tell me that a user object needs a username, it needs a password, it needs this, it needs that. These things are optional, these are things that are compulsory. So basically it defines the properties of the user, doesn't it? Just like the cookie cutter defines the property of the cookie. So the schema has all these plans, all these schematics, all these things for the different types of object in the Active Directory. Okay, so basically we have a schema object which has got these different attributes that's required, and from the schema we say we want to create a user. So we load this user schema, and then based on these requirements or this plan, we create a user which is for Adam Bar with a password of this and some other attributes and so forth. Okay. So basically, how do we know we need all these things? It's because it's from the schema. What is as Windows Server 2016 Active Directory? In Server 2016 Active Directory or AD, it is easier to detect events such as snapshot rollback, install and configure cloned virtual machines, prepare system before installing or upgrading domain controllers, use Windows PowerShell scripts to automate multiple Active Directory domain services installations. So if you've never heard of PowerShell, it's a command line based language. Okay. And if I haven't mentioned it already in this subject, wherever you can do with the graphical user interface in Server 2016, you can do with PowerShell. In fact, there's some things you can do with PowerShell you can't even do with the graphical user interface. But if you want to get really high level with your server administration, especially with Windows servers, you'll need to learn PowerShell. In this subject, we'll have a couple of sessions on PowerShell towards the end, but by no means is that all of it. Okay, it's a start. It gives you an idea of how it works and how to find help and how to use some of the things that we do in the subject, but it's certainly not all of it. We can also control who can have access to resources. We can recover objects from the Active Directory recycle bin, and we'll do a lot of this stuff in our lessons to come. And we can use this to manage the RID pool as well as defer index creation. With 2016, there's some more improvements in the enterprise. We can have what's called workplace joins, which allows consumer devices to participate in the domains. What does that mean? That means, hey, these computers are already part of the domain, right? That's fine. We own those equipment. But what about you? You've got laptops and you've got phones, you've got devices that you might bring from home. So the whole BYOD type situation, bring your own device, idea. So that we provide the infrastructure, but you can bring your own device and use our infrastructure. We can actually allow workplace joins, which actually lets us join your devices to the domain, but not really. They're not actually joined to the domain, but they're actually able to participate in the domain, even though you own the device and not the company. There's also a web application proxy, which allows applications to be published to the internet. There's a multi-factor access control, which basically, you guys probably know that we have to authenticate to get onto the network. Username, password is what you use. That's basic authentication. But what if we need a little bit more secure authentication? Well, multi-factor means using multiple things to authenticate you. Okay, so for example, it could be username, password plus a swipe card. Could be username, password plus fingerprint. Could be username, password plus facial recognition. So all of those things that you've probably seen or heard about, you can actually use in 2016 as for this multi-factor authentication. So that's, let's continue. There's also a global catalog server, okay, in Active Directory. The global catalog server hosts a partial attribute set for other domains in the forest and supports queries for the objects throughout this forest. It's a bit like the idea of the yellow pages. Okay, so just, you know how it is. In the yellow pages, if you're old enough, you might have seen that ad, where there's a tortoise and a hare, and the tortoise and the hare are both trying to look for something in the yellow pages, but the hare is going all over the yellow pages looking at all the ads and trying to find that particular service or ad, whereas the tortoise is slow and steady, goes to the index, and opens up, finds the thing, the plumber. Let's say he's looking for a plumber, finds the plumber section, flips over to the plumber pages, finds the thing, and gets there faster, right? The global catalog is like the index section. Okay, so basically, instead of actually going, looking, searching every domain and stuff in the whole forest, it's basically a partial attribute set. So it's just a little bit of information like the index, and allows you to search it without getting all the details, but getting enough details so it can lead you on to find the actual object you're looking for in the forest. If we look at the Active Directory domain service sign-in process a little bit closer, if we look at this workstation, basically when you guys this is like when you guys came in for the class today. You sat down on your computer, you turned it on, you typed in your username and password, and basically you sent those to the domain controller. The domain controller authenticated you, saying, hey, yes, you do check out. And once you've actually done that, you get what's called a TGT, ticket granting ticket. And then you can use that TGT and go access a server. Let's say this is the file server. And it will grant you a session ticket, which gives you access to the resources on that server at the appropriate level that you're meant to have. Okay? So basically, here's the steps, but I've just summarized them for you just then. We spoke about how we can have multiple domain controllers on a domain, but there's some tasks that only one person or one domain controller should do, because if you have too many people or too many domain controllers all doing the same things, it can get confusing. Okay, just think about it. If you were home and you're asking your dad, can I go out on Saturday night? And your dad says yes, but your mum, you asked your mum, can I go out on Saturday night? Your mum says no. What do? Do you go out or don't you go out? So if you ask if too many people are in charge of the same situation, you might get differing answers and get confused. In a domain, we have special functions that only one domain controller should do to avoid any confusion. And these are called operation masters. Okay, for some, we'll just briefly talk about them here. We'll look at more about them in the AWS subject, but there's a domain naming operation master. Basically, only one domain controller is in charge of that, which we only need one for the whole forest. Basically, if I want to create a new domain and I want to check if it's okay, it's legal, or it's okay to use, I ask the domain naming operation master if this domain name is okay. So if it's the same name as something that's already in the forest, then it will say no, you can't use that. If it's illegal characters, it will say no, you can't use that, and so forth. There's the infrastructure operation master, which ensures that the group changes are updated properly across the whole across the DCs. Okay, we spoke about the schema before. There's a schema master, which basically is the domain controller that is in charge of the schema, and if you want to update the schema, so by default when you install Server 2016, you get what's called a default schema. But if you need new schemes or new plans to be loaded in, for example, I'm going to install Exchange Server, and for that I need these additional objects in Active Directory, I can do what's called extending the schema. But instead of extending the schema every domain controller, I just have to go to the schema master and it's extended there, and then that gets replicated everywhere else. There's also a PDC emulator. Okay, in the past with Windows NT, instead of having domain controllers, which are all equal, we had domain controllers which were either PDCs or BDCs. PDCs were primary domain controllers, and BDCs were backup domain controllers. Okay, so you don't need to know so much about that because that was Windows NT Server. But obviously, we may still need a PDC. Okay, because for two reasons. One of them is that we could still have some Windows NT servers out there. Probably very unlikely, but it's potential. So therefore, they need a PDC. So the PDC emulator becomes the PDC for all those Windows NT BDCs. And also, the PDC emulator acts as the primary password change server. So basically, like I said, what if you had two domain controllers and people are changing the password on two domain controllers at the exact same time? Which one gets preference? So basically, they all have to check with the PDC to initiate the password change. Then there's the RID master, and this is a very important task. So I'm not sure if you know it, but every object that gets created in Active Directory has a what's a SID, okay, which is a security identifier. Just like you guys, you all have different student ID, don't you? Would it be really confusing if you had the same student ID, or two people had the same student ID? Because that's how we uniquely identify you here at TAFE, isn't it? So if you had two students who had the same student ID, it can get very confusing. So a RID master is the server which is responsible for the relative IDs. Okay, it basically has all the relative IDs, and if you guys are domain controllers and I'm the RID master, I will give you a pool of RIDs, and I will give you another pool of RIDs, and those RIDs will never be overlapping. So, but therefore, when someone creates an Active Directory object on you, they will use your RIDs and the GUID and combine and give you a unique security ID. And if they do it on you, they'll get a different security ID because they have different RIDs. You get that, guys? But ultimately, the RID master is responsible for managing these RIDs. Okay? So if I give you a pool and I give you another person a pool, those RIDs can never be overlapping within the pools. So that's a very important thing. Otherwise, you'll end up with people with the same SIDs. Okay? Okay, the next idea we're going to talk about is the idea of functional levels. Okay, let me just give you an analogy. Okay, if our class here, there's about, let's say 10 of us, and we all go for a walk. You guys all know about Waterfall Gully? Been to Waterfall Gully before? You know that you go from Waterfall Gully to Mount Lofty Summit, climb up that hill, right? It's a pretty steep hill if you've never been doing that. So if we all go for a walk, we went for an excursion, and we start climbing up the hill, how fast do you think we can do it? Well, it depends, isn't it? We can do it as fast as the slowest person, can't we? Okay, it doesn't matter if one of you guys is an Olympic athlete here, or a cross trainer or super fit. I'm pretty unfit, so you guys have to, if we want to do it as a group, we have to all wait for me as the last person. But you know what? That's like the functional level. I'll explain why. So if we have a situation where we have different versions of server, okay, we've got 2003, 2008, 2008 R2, 2012 and 2012 R2 and 2016. It says 2006 there, but I'll correct that, but it's 2016. You know that each version there's new features, isn't there? Improvements, new features. But you know what? If we have server 2003s in this Active Directory and their domain controllers, we can't just start using 2016 features that the 2003 server is not capable of. You get that? So as slow as the slowest person. So therefore, instead of actually using the 2016 features, we have to all drop down to the 2003 level, which means we cannot use any features that's newer than 2003. Okay, that's fine, that's good, and that's works, but obviously it means we can't use any of the newer, better features. So what does that mean? It means that we're stuck at that level, can't use any new features. But just like I walk in a waterfall gully, if I'm the slowest person, and I say to you guys go ahead, I'll just rest here, you get me on the way back, you drop me off, and I stay there. Now you can walk a little bit faster, can't you? You can go as fast as the next slowest person now, can't you? So it's just like if we had a 2003 server in our group, and we can't use any features that's above 2003, and suddenly the 2003 server is decommissioned, taken offline, retired. Now the next oldest server is actually 2012. Now suddenly we can raise our functional level, or the features we can use, to server 2012 level, can't we? Okay, you got to understand that we can raise the functional level, but we can't lower it, which means that 2003 server can never come back. Okay, so this functional level allows us to use features at a different levels. In Active Directory, there's a couple of services that are either critical or makes life very easy. Okay, for example, DNS, like I said, no DNS, no Active Directory. Okay, so you must have DNS in order to have Active Directory. DNS's main function is to resolve what's called fully qualified domain names like www.google.com into an IP address. Okay, that's its main function. There's also the DHCP service, which basically automatically allocates IP addresses, subnet masks, DNS settings, all that kind of stuff to your client computers. If you didn't have a DHCP server, you would have to manually go and type it in, and you can make mistakes, and it's a hassle, even doing 5, let alone 1,000. Okay. So if we actually look at DNS, in an Active Directory, DNS is essential for Active Directory. Okay. So first of all, DNS, there's a thing called hostname. A hostname is a name or alias to a computer, which is mapped to an IP address. Okay, we'll do this a little bit later as a networking service. A fully qualified domain name is a host name plus your domain name. Okay, so basically it's like server1.w2k12ad.local. Okay, or server1.tafesa.edu.au. That's a fully qualified domain name. A name service, name server is the DNS server. Okay, the DNS server that can resolve these host names or fully qualified domain names to IP addresses. In Windows, there's also a host file, which is really not used. This is actually for name resolution as well, but this is more for the days where you didn't have DNS. No one really uses it these days. Okay, so it's there. It's located in the C Windows System 32 drivers, etc. folder, but no one actually uses it, and we use DNS mainly. Like I mentioned, just going back, DNS, it's essential for Active Directory because besides resolving names to IP addresses and IP addresses to names like it traditionally does, in Active Directory actually has what's called service records, which actually tell the client computers who your authentication server is, who your Kerberos server is, who your global catalog server is, and so forth. Okay. So sites and replication. So with Microsoft Active Directory, you can have multiple sites. Okay, just like TAFE has multiple sites here, Adelaide, Mount Gambier, Mount Barker, Noarlunga, Elizabeth, many sites. Okay, so obviously a site is defined that within a site it's high-speed connections. Okay, within the Adelaide campus, it's at least gigabit for the whole LAN, isn't it? But between sites, you have a slower connection, usually some sort of WAN connection. Okay, that might be ADSL, that might be satellite, that might be microwave, there might be all sorts of WAN type connections. So Microsoft defines a site as a group of well-connected computers. In large organization, multiple locations can exist, and each location might be configured as a separate site and are built as from 3 primary components. They are the subnet, so each site would have to have at least a different subnet. You guys have learned that in 3WNF, haven't you? Okay, you can also have these site links, how the sites are connected, and either end of the site links you have what's called a bridgehead server, which basically controls how their inter-site replication occurs, when they occur, and if they were to be scheduled for different bandwidths at different times. So here's an example of a site. You've got a Los Angeles site and a Dallas site, and you can see they're connected by a WAN link, but within the site they're probably connected by at least a gigabit network. And you can see that the subnet IP address 10.10.10.0, 10.10.20.0/24, which has been obviously a Class A subnetted to a Class C. Sites and replication. So Active Directory replication, we already mentioned how domain controllers replicate with each other. But there's 2 types of replication. There's what's called intraset site replication. Replication that's on the same site. That happens all the time. Okay, as soon as there's a change, replication happens. So it happens anytime, anywhere. Okay, the service responsible for this replication is called the KCC, the Knowledge Consistency Checker. It builds a replication topology within the site and ensures there's no more than 3 hops exist between any 2 domain controllers wherever there's possible. Okay, the other type of replication is called inter-site, between-site replication. Okay, this occurs between Active Directory sites, and it's the ISTG, or inter-site topology generator process, determines the bridgehead servers to use for replication, and you can actually control the schedule of the replication. So you may not want the replication to occur in the busy times during the day. You might want to do it at non-busy times. When we're talking about planning Active Directory, it's a 5-step process, okay? So basically, you determine, first of all, you go from top down, go from the biggest thing, how many forests do you need? Okay, so for a large, super large, complex company, you may need multiple forests, but most likely you probably need 1, okay? How many domains? Again, depends how big your business is, how complicated you want to make it, how many different areas. Okay, so assign domain names. What are you going to call these domains? Select the forest root. And then when you've finished doing all that, then you look at the actual organizational units and the different departments you're going to have in each of the domains. And that's called the detailed design. And to be honest, you guys, leaving at this level, finishing this subject, you probably wouldn't be doing any of this. To be honest, you'll probably be given a design, and you'll be the person, if you do anything for it, implementing it. So you probably at this level, at the Cert 4 level, you wouldn't be doing these design. You'll be implementing a design that's given to you. If we look at the detailed design, which is a step 5, well, that's what we like to focus on. And if you look at your assignment, okay, so don't forget there's an assignment. You'll be asked to actually design an Active Directory. In your designing, you need to work out how you're going to plan your organizational units. Okay, usually organizational units follow the company structure. For example, TAFE-SA might be the domain, but under TAFE-SA you might have the different sites. Okay, or you could have the different departments, IT studies, hair and beauties, etc. Determine the number of domain controllers, where you're going to place the domain controllers, where you're going to place the global catalog, and selecting the operational master placement, and then planning the site design. So here's an example of a design. This is called a mix OU hierarchy. So you can see that, first of all, they based it on different departments: engineering, technical support, sales. Then underneath them, they have power users and standard users. So this is one example. There's no right or wrong answers, really. There's really well-adapted solutions or poorly adapted solutions. Okay, this is just one example. Installing a domain controller on the server 2016. So you'll see this when we do the worksheet, to be honest. And basically what we have to do is actually go to our server manager, There's a two-step process. Go to our server manager. We add the Active Directory domain services role. That's step one. Step two, you actually then promote that computer as a domain controller. So once you install the Active Directory domain services role, you install that first, then you'll have a little link that allows you to promote it. Method one, you can do it with a graphical user interface by using Server Manager and so forth, and go for a wizard. Okay, that helps you choose where the files are to be stored, where the database is to be stored, and the names. The wizard helps you out quite a bit. Okay, that's what we're going to do in this subject. But later on, when we do our PowerShell in the future, we're going to actually install it using PowerShell. We can do it locally on the same computer by entering the commands, or we can use WinRM, which is basically a remote PowerShell, remote management, which allows us to execute PowerShell remotely. And here's an example of some of the commands. So install Windows feature AD domain services, basically installs the server role. Install AD domain controller, promotes the computer as a domain controller. Like I said, we won't be doing this today, but we'll be doing it in the PowerShell section. What we'll be doing is this first method, which is using the graphical user interface. Okay, there's a couple of questions, just like the other day when we talked about upgrading or migrating a server. Well, with a domain controller, it's the same idea. Do you upgrade the options for upgrading an Active Directory domain services to a Windows Server 2016? So if you want to do an upgrade, you can do an in-place upgrade from Server 2012 to 2016. The benefits is that except for prerequisite checks, all the files and programs stays in place, and there's no additional work required. Once you upgrade, it's done. But the risk is that you may leave many legacy problems, files, DLLs on the system. Okay. Introduced new in Server 2016, you can actually do the migration. You can introduce a new Server 2016 into your network, install Active Directory domain services, promote it as a domain controller, and then just basically replicate all the information from your existing 2012 domain controller to the 2016. Okay, the benefits is that the new servers do not have any accumulated legacy problems, files, or settings. Okay, but the risk is that you need to do additional work. You need to have a separate server. Okay, yeah, that's migrating it. Whereas the first one is the in-place upgrade. Okay, so you just upgrade the operating system of the existing domain controller. Whereas this is you building a new server, Server 2016, making it into a domain controller, and then basically letting Active Directory replicate from the 2012 to the 2016. Yeah, as soon as you say that this is a domain controller as part of the existing domain, it will be automatic once that's done. Okay. There's also, Windows Azure, Microsoft Azure. You heard of that, guys? So it's basically Microsoft's cloud platform, where actually it's a cloud platform. It's a multi-tenanted platform. What does that mean? That means lots of different companies use it. It's a cloud, so instead of owning the hardware, you rent the hardware, and somewhere in the cloud. Okay, the cloud it's called a cloud because there's no fixed shape. You rent as much as you need. You can move, scale up, scale down relatively easily. You pay for what you need or use. Okay, so on Microsoft Azure, there's many different types of services. There's infrastructure as a service, there's platform as a service, there's software as a service. Okay, you might have heard of all those terms. As you can see here, you can subscribe to Microsoft Office 365, just like what TFSA is doing. Okay, so basically what does that mean? That means that we can access Office 365 online, anywhere. It's hosted in the cloud. We can have Link, Skype for Business, SharePoint, Exchange, email, and basically all the authentication. Remember how we can log into our email, log into our Office 365, all with your TFSA credentials, can't you? Where are they coming from? They can be synchronizing back to your Active Directory on your site, on premises. Okay, so there's Windows Azure Active Directory. That could be a totally separate situation, or it could be a situation where it's hybrid, which means it synchronizes back to your on premises. So basically, that's what Active Directory can lead to. That's not something we're going to cover in this subject, but that's something we can lead to. We're starting off with just Active Directory in this subject, but that's where it can lead to. We can extend Active Directory domain services to Microsoft Azure Virtual Machine Clouds. Enables new scenarios, including cloud-only deployments, so where we have only a cloud presence, there's no linking back to our on-site. So we apply authentication. So for example, if you got a new app, you develop a new app called Flappy Birds or something like that, and you need people to log in to play that, where do you keep the user accounts? You can keep it on a Active Directory that's in Azure. So it runs applications in Active Directory isolated from your corporate directory. It supports extranet applications, or you can have the hybrid deployment where you do have Active Directory Azure, but it links back or synchronizes from your on-premises. Just like how TAFE-SA, you can log into the computer here at TAFE-SA from our Active Directory. You can also go online, use Office 365, your email, everything, and still use the same credentials. So that's the end of our PowerPoint. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to open up your worksheet 2 and work on there. And obviously, when you need help, you need to contact me or call me over, okay? So once...